Assalamu alaikum. I am Ammara Zaheer and welcome again to another episode of PIPS Talks. Today's discussion will be revolving around Afghanistan relations and security border and Taliban. So Pakistan and Afghanistan share a deep historical and geographical ties, yet nearly 5 years after the Taliban returned to the power, their relationship continues to face security and diplomatic challenges. We'll explore today why bilateral relationships have deteriorated, how the TTP has reshaped Pakistan's security landscape, and what policy options Islamabad has moving forward. To help unpack this, as all we have with us Mr. Safdar Hussain with us, who's also known by his pen name Safdar Sial, and he is a research analyst at Pakistan Institute of Peace Studies, and his research focuses on conflicts, insecurity, regional security dynamics in Pakistan and Afghanistan. I welcome you on the show, sir.
Yeah, thank you, Mara.
Thank you, sir. So, sir, let us begin with our questions. The first question being that Pakistan and Afghanistan have historically oscillated between strategic cooperation and strategic mistrust. So, in the aftermath of Taliban's return to power, what structural factors rather than immediate political disagreements have contributed to the current deterioration of bilateral relations? And does this represent a temporary diplomatic impasse or a fundamental shift in the relationship of both the countries?
Yes, let's start with the security burden. I think you asked about this the post-Taliban government in Kabul 2021. So I think since then, Pakistan has been bearing a huge burden in terms of terrorism and insecurity, cross-border militancy, and the data from Pak Institute for Peace Studies, Security Digital Database says that more than 2,000 terrorist attacks have happened since then. The exact number is 2,269 attacks, and more than 700 of these attacks were carried out by Baloch nationalists and the similar militant groups like Hafizul Bahadur and Jamaatul Ahrar or other religiously inspired militant actors, mostly in Khyber Pakhtunkhwa and extent in other parts of the country, Balochistan and recently in Sindh as well. That's basically a core problem between Pakistan and Afghanistan because throughout this process of negotiations which we were having with Afghanistan Taliban government and different mediators starting from Qatar, Saudi Arabia and then China. So eventually the talks broke due to this core issue of TTP, terrorism, cross-border militancy, incursions. So this remains the major issue between Pakistan and Afghanistan. And last year was the worst year in terms of terrorist attacks, and that continues throughout 2026. This going down, cross-border incursions are increasing, and in recent months we have seen that not only the Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, but the TTP and the similar groups like Jamaatul Harar, they have been trying to expand their areas of operation. Within this month, we saw the Ziyarat and Quetta attacks by the TTP, and a few weeks before we saw that Jamaatul Ahrar carried out a major attack in Karachi against the Rangers camp. So this situation doesn't tell well about how the Pakistan and Afghanistan's relations are have been evolving. Since 2010, a gradual increase in terrorist attacks, and it's not going down. Secondly, if you ask me the long-standing structural issue, we know well that has been the Durand line, and the Afghan Taliban recently have been using this issue just to seek the domestic legitimacy because they have issues within the country, they have issues on international arena. So when they try to seek legitimacy within the country, this nationalism, Pashtun nationalism, the issue of Durand line, and this posture that we are tough towards Pakistan, these things serve them well within the country somehow to seek the domestic legitimacy. And we saw recently when Pakistan carried out the cross-border strike, how the Afghan Taliban responded in terms of propaganda and tried to win the local support. So this is one issue very old, but the Taliban just trying to revive it, putting it in Pashtun nationalistic narratives and this is helping them to some extent. So Pakistan basically has invested heavily in diplomatic engagement post 2021. If you remember, when the Taliban captured Kabul, they formed government in Afghanistan. Pakistan extended very friendly hand, and but the main concern was the same, which remains so far, the TTP issue and the cross-border terrorism. But the expectations went unmet, and that have been pushing the relationship towards open war language until this year 2026. So if you ask me that what has been the current recent situation after this fundamental shift, so I will say that Kabul has been unwilling to act against the TTP, and Pakistan has also adopted a very solid position that there will be no change in Pakistan's intent to engage with the Taliban unless the issue of TTP is resolved. So but the real issue behind this framing, I will say, is that the Taliban regime disputes the TTP presence on its soil and continuously it says that this is Pakistan's own problem. So this is the recent structural problem, and the old structural problems, I will not go deeper into those.
Thank you, sir. My second question to you will be about the Pakistan-Afghan border has evolved from a geographical boundary into a multi-dimensional security challenge. So, to what extent can military measure alone address cross-border militancy, and what combination of border governance, intelligence, cooperation, and sustained diplomatic engagement would be necessary to transform the frontier zone?
Yeah, this is also linked to this TTP militancy cross-border incursions. So internal Pakistan security and terrorism problem. So the core issue remains the same. So why Pakistan is concerned about the border, the same issue of the TTP and other militants, even the Baloch insurgents. Pakistan says they have safe havens within Afghanistan, and they are making trouble for Balochistan and Khyber Pakhtunkhwa provinces. So Pakistan launched its Ghazab Dil Haq operation, and apart from that, Pakistan has been conducting these intelligence-based operations in the bordering region along the Pakistan-Afghanistan border. So these kinetic actions have been successful to a certain extent. But beyond that, there is a problem if you analyze it in realistic terms, because the terrorism is not going down. The militancy, the incidents of terrorist violence and the militancy and insurgency within the Balochistan, they are not going down. So that means there is some problem within this kinetic approach. Although we hear and read on daily basis that so many militants are being killed in Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, in Balochistan. So what does that mean? That these kinetic actions are intensified in recent months and weeks. But even then, the militancy continues to increase. So the problem basically is that the kinetic actions alone cannot resolve this issue of insurgency and terrorism, because you can't hold the areas you clear. To sustain those outcomes and output through kinetic action, to sustain them, Pakistan needs certain political interventions. And those political interventions basically should be very comprehensive. And they should start from winning hearts and minds of the people. Then community engagement and cooperation is essential that for those outcomes and successes to sustain. And thirdly, there is a need to initiate political dialogue and reconciliation within Balochistan and within Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, not with the militants or the TTP, but with the communities and within the tribal people who are suffering, because that is the key problem within these two problems, the two provinces, that when the people are not cooperating, their grievances are increasing, then the counter terrorism kinetic actions will not provide the required results. And then I think there is a dire need for some comprehensive de-radicalization and counter-extremism measures. Those measures which we term that these are soft measures, and those are political initiatives. So those are needed, and they will eventually cut the public support for the militants in terms of cutting the recruitment and funding for them. And finally, I will say that the improved governance and rule of law. because when there is no governance, the rule of law is not there. So there are voids, political voids, where these militants operate, and which also provide some justification for the people to somehow support the narratives which are being projected and promoted by the Baloch nationalist insurgents and also the militants. So overall, I will say that the kinetic operations, the militant operations, they have been manifesting that there is capability to counter this threat in terms of security perspective or framework. But still, as I said earlier, the persistence of attacks that continues mid 2026 is a reminder that unilateral strike, only the kinetic actions need pairing with broader broader the initiatives, including the border governance, because if we are hoping that the Afghan Taliban will resolve these problems for us, then it is our issue, our problem. The assessment is not the correct. So Afghan Taliban are not going to help because this is their leverage, and they are not going to squander this leverage through these TTP attacks and other militancy and cross-border incursions. So this is the basic, I think, the yeah, I was just saying that Pakistan has demonstrated resolve and has manifested that it has the capacity to counter the terrorism and counter terrorist threat. But the missing ingredient is the Afghan cooperation, and we should not basically anticipate and hope for that because Afghanistan is not going to help because this TTP, other militancy, cross-border incursion, these are their strategic leverage against Pakistan whenever it comes to the bilateral engagement. So we should resolve this issue on our own and just start the political initiatives as well to supplement and complement that kinetic initiative through military actions we are having.
The Taliban's takeover of Afghanistan in 2021 fundamentally altered the regional security landscape. How has the new political reality in Kabul reshaped the strategic calculations of Pakistan, and what implication does it have for regional counterterrorism efforts?
Yes, as I mentioned earlier, that Pakistan extended significant goodwill to the Taliban government post 2021. So Pakistan's assumption was that the Afghan Taliban will help us counter this threat of militancy and cross-border insecurity. But that has not materialized basically, and that assumption was tested seriously by Kabul's reluctance to move against the TTP. So Pakistan, since then, since 2021, has raised as an explicit official concern that Afghan territory is being used by the TTP and other militant groups. And these hostile actors basically have been the main problem, as we discussed earlier. And there have been efforts. Afghan Taliban initially helped in dialogue with the TTP, and those efforts had been ongoing until Pakistan realized that these are not going to work. And after the mediation from different other countries as well, and even China recently, this didn't help. So Afghan Taliban basically remained stuck to their position that they were not willing, they have not been willing so far to act against the TTP. And China's continuing mediation, we don't know this so-called room talk, that if this process will revive or not, because Pakistan's openness to party engagement that remains, but at certain conditions now. Those conditions are that guarantees, very written guarantees that the Afghan Taliban will take the required action against the militants who are acting against Pakistan. But as I said earlier, seeking the resolution of domestic militancy problem through the Afghan Taliban action is likely are giving them the leverage to play with Pakistani security. Pakistan should revisit policy and to be able to manage its security problems with or without the cooperation from Afghanistan. Because this is, I personally believe that the Afghan Taliban feel like Pakistan is giving them this leverage. Okay, help us, help us countering TTP threat, help us countering the BLA border security issues. Without the help of Afghan Taliban, we are able to reduce the threat and the risk of this terrorist violence within the country. Although it's very difficult to manage this long border with Afghanistan, but still, I think when we continue externalizing and putting the larger problem across the border on the Afghanistan or the Afghan Taliban, then means the local responsibilities and the actions which should be very comprehensive and ultimately the whole response becomes kinetic response and the political and soft responses they still continue remaining missing. So that is the problem which I have been highlighting again and again, that Pakistan should strengthen its internal domestic counter-terrorism and counter-insurgency policies with or without any support from the Afghan Taliban. So that is a realistic analysis, threat assessment of the problem and the inherent solution.
So, sir, as you mentioned, that TTP is the bone of contention between the bilateral relationship between Afghanistan and Pakistan. So, what realistic policy option remain available for Pakistan without triggering a deeper bilateral crisis with Afghanistan?
So yeah, that is the core problem as we discussed earlier. And that's why Pakistan has been insisting recently that we are not going to revive any bilateral engagement with the Taliban unless there is some serious response from the Taliban on the front of this TTP issue. And all those engagements starting from 2021 and then in 22, the talks with the Taliban mediated by the Taliban initially and then Safdar visit 2024 and eventually the China's Rumki. We what we see that the TTP attacks have increased. So TTP basically gradually getting emboldened. So why? The reason I see personally is that there is no any constraint on them, any curbs on them within Afghanistan. They can recruit, they can move, they can train, they can get the funds. So that freedom to operate and move across the border, that has been growing and increasing with the support from the Afghan Taliban, or at least lack of action from Afghan Taliban. So, what Pakistan has the realistic policy options. So, I think what Pakistan is doing right now, first thing that rigid condition and compulsion on the Afghan Taliban that we are willing to talk, but first correct your behavior and give some written solid guarantees against the terrorist group, including the TTP and other. The continued targeted operations against these threats, the TTP and other BLA and other militant groups, and sustained pressure through the refugee repatriation process and continued push for enforceable return commitments from Kabul, as I said earlier, rather than the verbal assurances. But again, what is lacking is managing internal security without waiting for the Taliban to come and help. That is the key policy response that has been. So the context which is critical and primary context here is the Kabul denies harboring TTP. When it denies, how it commits to act against it. And that is the core issue.
So my last question to you would be that in your assessment, what would be a sustainable framework for normalizing bilateral relations between the two countries? Should the future engagement be based on prioritizing security cooperation, economic interdependence, or a regional activity or confidence building measures?
Yes, I will say that given Pakistan's repeated good faith engagement with the Taliban, as I mentioned earlier, to 24 Kabul visit by Safdar, before that engagement with the TTP, and then how Pakistan has been managing this issue of what they call the refugee leverage diplomacy, and then Pakistan is still open to accept any mediation from China, Qatar, Saudi Arabia. These mediations failed basically due to the rigid response from the refusal against TP. So the logical next step is, I think, somehow similar that as Pakistan is already doing, holding Kabul accountable to verifiable written counter-terrorism commitment, not simply more rounds of talk and those useless talks and talk. And then sequencing that centers Pakistan's legitimate security needs. Enforceable action against TTP first, then trade transit normalization. Okay, after that, deeper connectivity. So, in that order, since Pakistan has consistently said security must precede economic normalization, but the Taliban, throughout these talks and dialogues, they were not even willing to talk about the security. They were only more committed and willing to talk about trade and economic concession. But I think that order, Pakistan, how it has reversed, that is significant and important thing. So that is to start with enforceable action against TTP. Okay, then we'll start the confidence building measures. Okay, then will come the trade present normalization, which is then on hold. Obviously, then deeper connectivity will come the China BRI and CPEC, all other things. So again, principal obstacle, as I mentioned earlier, is Kabul's unwillingness to treat TTP as the red line. For them, it's leverage. For Pakistan, it is a red line. So that divergence is basically that is not letting this any. So until that framework, the current situation, I think that will hold, and that is.
Thank you so much, sir, for your time today. We will see you again in another video. Until then, like, share, and subscribe the channel. Thank you for watching.